So let's talk about survey research, which is one common way to collect data, especially if you want data from a large number of people. These days it's most commonly done online, but surveys can be administered over the telephone, by mail, in a live setting like a big classroom or a convention or other event. And the benefit of doing it, say, online or by telephone or mail, is you can potentially sample from the entire population in a way that's representative. And that's whether you do simple random sampling, where everyone out there has the same chance of being surveyed, or some other sort of systematic sampling. You can get a better sample than you might for a lot of things where you have to work with just the people nearby, convenience sample. So what sets surveys apart from many other types of research in psychology is that it's fundamentally based on self-report data. That doesn't mean you can't also collect behavioral data, like covertly measuring how long it takes someone to click an answer in an online survey. But what makes it a survey at its heart is all the self-report questions that they're filling out overtly. Now, when you hear survey, you may think of the stereotypical question like, how well did the customer service rep do on a scale from 1 to 10? Or, some other numerical answer scale. But to be clear, surveys can collect quantitative or qualitative data, or a mix of both. So a question might ask, how old are you? Where the respondent fills in the blank with a number, and the data then is on a ratio scale of measurement, right? It's a numerical thing. Or it might be more of like an interval or ordinal scale of measurement, like how depressed do you feel from 1 to 7, or giving some statement and asking whether you strongly disagree, neither agree nor disagree, agree, or strongly agree. These ones are called Likert items, by the way, or Likert items, when the options are kind of symmetrical and bipolar. There's like a positive and a negative end, but it's symmetrical. Or it can even be totally open-ended questions, where the participants can write out sentences of response. All of those are valid options on a survey. Another common misconception is that surveys are only correlational, but surveys can be experimental or non-experimental like that, depending on how you design it. So modern survey software, it'll let you set things up to, say, randomize each participant into different conditions when they start the survey. So if you randomly assign each participant to see a different version, or a different stimulus, or a different wording, to read a different vignette, whatever it is, that's absolutely an experimental design, because you're manipulating an independent variable and randomly assigning people into those groups. That can get at causation questions, even though it's a self-report survey. Now, when it comes to designing a survey as a researcher, one of the first things you need to realize is that the wording you choose really matters. You can unintentionally, or even intentionally, sway respondents to answer a certain way, depending on how you phrase things. So a classic historical example is this polling data from a presidential election back in the 90s when this guy Ross Perot ran as a third-party candidate. Perot's people asked, should laws be passed to eliminate all possibilities of special interests giving huge sums of money to candidates? And the vast majority of people at the time, they agreed. Like 80% of people wanted some restrictions. But at the same time, CNN used a very different wording to survey people about the same issue. Should laws be passed to prohibit interest groups from contributing to campaigns? Or do groups have a right to contribute to the candidates they support? Suddenly, worded that way, the majority of people don't want any restrictions. You can sample from the same set of people, you can get data from the same people, but have them answer completely differently just based on the wording that you gave them. So remember that when you're hearing about the results of some poll during election season. Was it done by a fairly respected nonpartisan polling organization like Pew Research, or by more potentially biased sources like Fox News or the Jacobin or whatever? Now, this idea that wording changes how people answer has a name in cognitive psychology. It's the framing effect. When presenting the same option in different formats can alter people's decisions, that's framing. So for example, there's research showing that wording a choice in a way that emphasizes risk will make people choose differently than if you word the exact same choice, the exact same decision and options in a way that emphasizes, sort of verbally emphasizes the gains instead of the risks. Another way to phrase this for survey research is that people will give inconsistent responses to the same fundamental question if it's asked in different ways. But let's move on to some other important factors that you might want to think about when constructing a survey. So imagine running into this question on a survey. Should we outlaw eating babies but not eating puppies? Yes or no? If someone chooses no here, does that mean they want both foods outlawed? or neither food outlawed, like they don't want anything outlawed. It's unclear from the wording. And that's because we used what's called a double-barreled question, meaning we actually, maybe accidentally, asked multiple things in the same question. In that case, people will often get confused how to respond, especially if they want to say yes to one part of a question but not to the other part. It also means that you as a researcher can't really interpret your own results in a clear way, since you often don't know how the participant interpreted your question. So it's kind of unclear what a yes or a no from that person really means, or if everyone's yes means the same thing. You also want to avoid questions like this. Has your mom stopped sleeping with me yet? Yes or no? And it's a silly example, but the point is both responses assume their mom slept with me at some point, which may or may not be true, but they have no option to disagree with that assumption. So it's important to avoid what we call leading questions, ones that maybe push for or assume a particular answer or a particular viewpoint within your question. Or how about this question? Do you not think that people don't do enough to avoid double negative questions, yes or no? While we could sit down for just a minute and parse the grammar here, most survey takers are not going to put in the cognitive effort or may not be able to make sense of a question like this properly. So the answer they give becomes kind of uninterpretable when you're not even sure they understood the question. Which means what we want to avoid is these double negatives as much as possible, but also anything else that might confuse them in kind of the grammar of the sentence. And even if the sentence only has one possible meaning, one actual meaning, that doesn't mean people will interpret it properly. So yeah, a double negative, written well, a double negative can have just one clear, unambiguous meaning, except that some people will still get confused when you word it that way. So if you can find a way to word it without a double negative, and in general, just find a way to keep your wording simple, you're more likely to get valid answers. Now, sometimes when you're talking about the strategy or the things you should think about constructing questionnaires when making surveys is this acronym BRUSO. It's kind of a handy mnemonic when you're constructing survey questions. It gives 5 qualities to think about as you write a question, or after you've written a question, to go back and check each of these things. So first, keep each question brief. Avoid long, complicated wording that can confuse people. Try and get right to the point. So like, do you currently have a pet? Is better than something like, do you presently own, shelter, or consider yourself one of the primary caretakers of an animal which you or those around you consider a pet? That is way too long and confusing and unnecessary when you can just get straight to the point. Brief. Do you currently have a pet? Okay, questions should also be relevant. It might be tempting in a survey to ask anything and everything in the hopes you might find a pattern later, but for one thing, that can create survey fatigue, since people drop out of long surveys or they start responding half-assedly and not reading closely. But also, asking an irrelevant side question might put people in a different frame of mind, and that might make them answer differently to some of the rest of your questions that you really do care about. Additionally, you might want to make sure the questions are unambiguous as much as possible. So asking, are you a cat person? Might seem like a straightforward question, but it's kind of weird, since what does it even mean to be a cat person? Does that mean you like cats, or that you like cats more than other common pets like dogs? Or does it mean you currently own a cat or multiple cats? Everyone's going to interpret that a little differently. So instead, ask something that won't be interpreted ambiguously, like simply, do you own one or more cats? Something like that. Questions should also be specific. So this is where that problem of like double-barreled questions might come into play. If a question asks about 2 different things, but only allows one way of answering, it's not specific enough. And likewise, if it asks something super broad, like, how do you feel about your taxes? That might not answer the question you really have, which might be, do you support the proposed new alcohol tax? So be specific when you can. And finally, questions should be objective, meaning they should not be leading, they should not reveal your own views as a researcher. Basically, as much as possible, use neutral wording. Okay, another thing to ensure is that closed-ended questions, the one where they have to, select one option from a list of options, should make sure that the options altogether are mutually exclusive and also exhaustive. So mutually exclusive means no overlap. In other words, multiple options won't apply to that person, which would make them have to choose among them which they should click, even though multiple might be true. On the other hand, exhaustive means you've given all the possible options, all the possibilities are considered, so no one will be left out where their answer just isn't found on the list of options. So to give an example, imagine in a survey I ask how many hours per week someone works. I might list the options like this. But imagine someone has a job where they are contracted to work exactly 40 hours per week. So their answer is 40. Do they select the third option? Because that has 40 in it. Or do they select the fourth option? Both have the number 40 in them, so they're not mutually exclusive. That makes this a bad question. And likewise, imagine someone who doesn't work, or maybe just works less than 10 hours per week. Those people have no valid option to click based on these here as my options in the question. Now we can improve things a lot by, say, adding an option for those people at the bottom, and also make sure no value shows up at two different places. So we can switch, instead of going 20 to 30, we go 20 to 29. Like, now it's clear what to choose if you work 0 hours a week, or 10 hours a week, or 50 hours a week. Now it does still leave things a little unclear for someone who wants to answer 9.5. So this is not fully exhaustive yet, but you can see how it's much better, right? It'll have many fewer problems. Now, just as an aside, you can have a closed-ended question that's more of a check all that apply style, in which case the options don't need to be mutually exclusive. Like a question asking someone's gender identity might have options like male, female, non-binary, queer, and other. And presumably, there are plenty of people who would actually apply more than one of those labels to themselves. So the best option in that case when writing a question like that is allowing them to check all that apply. But for now, let's move on to another logistical issue when you're constructing surveys. Imagine you're running polls back when Obama was president, and you're asking a bunch of questions about whether respondents think Obama is doing a good job. Right? This could be any president or whatever. Whether they're happy with how he's handling the economy, whether they're happy with how he's handling defense, and so on. So you've got a bunch of questions where the high number, like 7, the option on the left here, is always the one that corresponds with liking what he's doing. What can happen, especially in a long survey, is people stop reading closely and they just start selecting all the answers on that side. Now they're not giving kind of their real answers. So, someone who dislikes Obama might start circling the ones on the right, the ones, the low numbers. They're just circling and circling and basically see a pattern, and they start just answering 1, 1, 1, 1, 1 without actually reading or thinking about it. So you might actually get to a question where their opinion would be different, but they're not even reading closely enough to circle the true answer now. Hence, you get things like this, where it's just like a straight line of all the same answer, which suggests someone might have gone on autopilot. Their data might not be accurate. So we actually have a trick when writing out a long survey, or when we're trying to develop a psychometrically valid questionnaire to measure something like anxiety or whatever in a standardized way. That trick is to add in reverse scored questions. So you mix in questions where the wording is reversed. So on those ones, answering 7 is the option that, disapproves of Obama, and answering 1 is the option that approves of him. Or like in a scale diagnosing anxiety, on some questions, 7 is the most anxious answer option, and on some questions, a 7 means the no anxiety option. Or if you're measuring like personality traits using something like the Big 5 inventory, some questions about introversion might give a statement like, I prefer being alone, where you agree or disagree, right? But others might phrase it in the opposite manner, like, I prefer being around others, where you can have to agree or disagree. So now people have to actually stop and read and make sense of it and choose the right answer. They can't just half-assedly go down and circle everything on the same side. So in our silly example for an old president, you could imagine switching around some of the questions where now the option that dislikes him is occasionally a 7 rather than a 1. Does that make sense? That's reverse scored questions. Okay, in practice, this means it takes a bit more effort to tally up the numbers to get an overall score, but what you do is just add a step where before you analyze your data, where you take all those reverse scored questions and convert each answer number to its opposite. So if it was on a 1 to 7 scale, a 7 becomes a 1 becomes a 7, that sort of thing. Mathematically, you could also just say you take the minimum score plus the maximum score and subtract whatever they circled. This might sound a little more confusing, but think of it like on a scale of 1 to 7, the minimum plus the maximum, so 1 plus 7 is 8. And if they selected a 3, that was their answer, then you just do the 8 minus their answer of 3 and gives you a 5. That's what it should be on these reverse scored questions. A 3 becomes a 5. And likewise, a 5 would become a 3. It comes out the same whichever way you do the switching, but you just have to remember which ones you wrote in the reverse style. And you'll often see this in sort of formal, highly tested, highly used scales for measuring things like depression, anxiety, or whatever. That way, by the end, the high total score on your survey will mean the thing you want it to mean. Like a high total might mean they like Obama, a low total might mean they dislike Obama, after we've corrected for those reverse scored questions. Here's a real life example, by the way, with reverse scoring. This is from the benevolent sexism scale, which is a tool to measure that kind of white knight form of sexism. So look at question 5. Women should be cherished and protected by men. Or question 11, women tend to have a more refined sense of culture and good taste. It's the sort of paternalistic, protecting, or like putting women on a pedestal rather than treating them as full, normal, complex humans. It's that kind of sexism. So for most of these questions, agreement would be, like if you agree to a statement, would be a sign of benevolent sexism. But some questions were written to go the other way. So if you look at questions 2, 3, and 7, they are reversed. In question 2, disagreeing means you believe women need to be specially protected, rather than agreeing meaning that. So to total up someone's score on the benevolent sexism scale, you have to reverse the scoring on 2, 3, and 7. Then you add it all up, and you have a ranking of who has higher, more benevolent sexism and who has lower. All right. Another thing to think about when constructing a survey is to avoid order effects as much as possible. So order effects, meaning the things you asked about earlier might have got them thinking, whatever, might end up unconsciously biasing their later responses. So for example, imagine I'm doing a survey on eating, something like that. If you start with questions that prime people to think about their lack of willpower and how overweight they are, then later, on later questions, they might respond more negatively when you ask questions about eating habits or about how much they enjoy junk food or something like that. So you get different answers than you would if you had just asked those later questions at the start without any earlier priming. Or another example, say you're measuring how math beliefs about math, how valuable it is, how interesting it is, whatever, you're measuring how math beliefs might relate to math performance. Those are your variables. If you first measure math performance, and maybe it's like you have people do some math questions, and some of your respondents do poorly, and then after that you ask them their beliefs and opinions about math, it might lead to more negative responses and beliefs. People saying they dislike math or that it shouldn't be emphasized as much in schooling, but that's because you got them into a certain mindset by having them fail at some math first. And there are lots of real-life examples of order effects out there, but this is a famous one from Pew Research back in the early 2000s, so this is before gay marriage was legalized in the United States. Pew at the time asked a question. They were asking not specifically about gay marriage, they were actually looking at legal agreements called a civil union with the same legal rights as marriage, and at the time, if you just straight up asked people about this in kind of a representative polling of Americans, most people actually opposed it. 55% opposed it, and 37% agreed with it. But now look at the bottom version here, the bottom way of laying out their little phone survey. So here Pew first asked about support for gay marriage, and at the time, sadly, most people were opposed. But look what happens when they asked about civil unions right after that question. Now, when asked as the second question, people are much more in favor of that proposal. No longer do they more than half of people oppose it, and indeed about as many people favor it as oppose it now, simply because you first asked them about gay marriage. So you've created a sort of contrast in people's minds or put them into a certain frame, and now many people will answer the same question differently. Likewise, here's a different example that Pew put out back in 2008. So this is at the tail end of George W. Bush's presidency. They asked how satisfied people were with the country overall. For some people, they asked that question first, and 78% of people said they were dissatisfied with the country. But for other people, they asked about Bush himself first, then they asked about the country overall. And now people answered that same question about the overall satisfaction with the country. They answered it differently, with 88% now saying they were dissatisfied. So that's a big swing for the exact same question, the exact same opinion, just because one other thing was asked about first. So that's order effects. So one trick we can use if we think order effects will be an issue is that we often counterbalance the question order, or if you're doing multiple surveys, multiple scales, you might counterbalance the survey order, or the order in which they get the different scales. So like half of your participants would get survey 1, or the first half of your questions, and then they get survey 2 afterward, or the second half of the questions afterward. But then the other half of your participants, they're going to get things in the opposite order. So for example, if you were giving a scale of test anxiety to a bunch of students, so you're measuring test anxiety, and you also give a scale measuring locus of control. So the psychological idea, locus of control. Some people have more of it, some people have less. So you're measuring test anxiety and locus of control. You might have some participants take the test anxiety scale first, and then they do the locus of control, and the other participants do the locus of control scale first and the test anxiety scale after that. So this not only will help kind of balance out some of the possible ordering effects in both of those directions, so sort of canceling some of it out, but more importantly, later on it's going to let you test statistically whether some order effects were present. Like we saw before with the Pew examples, we'll be able to notice if asking about one thing at the start tended to shift people's answers, and that's going to help us interpret the data, whatever data that we happen to get. So yeah, we can kind of compare those later to see. Or you could alternatively just randomize all the questions. So take all the questions in your survey, especially if you're giving it to a whole bunch of people, randomize the question order entirely on every copy. So it's a similar idea. Again, these solutions are not going to completely remove all order effects. We can't do that if they're answering multiple questions. But what it'll do is minimize the biasing effects by balancing out a lot of those order effects and also allowing us to detect and quantify them. All right, just a couple more logistical concerns with survey design. Sometimes you might want to ask about things that some people consider private or embarrassing. Like the question, do you ever fantasize about people of the same gender as yourself? Now, you might not have any problem answering this question honestly, but surely you can imagine some people you've known in the past or seen or heard of who might be tempted to give what they think is a socially desirable or safe answer. Like, imagine a guy who thinks of himself as mostly just heterosexual, but has occasionally fantasized about men, and he's being interviewed. Maybe he's being interviewed by a researcher who's a woman who he finds attractive, and she asks this question as part of the research. Now, given certain societal messages that lead to a sort of fragile or toxic idea of masculinity, he might feel compelled to answer no, even if that's not the true answer for him. Or imagine a question about illegal drug use or illegal theft behavior or something. Or perhaps even trying to ask about things widely considered unacceptable or immoral, like bestiality. You may not get the true answer out of people if you're asking them directly, especially if they'll be turning in a survey that they're taking on paper in the room next to a researcher, or if they're answering on the phone with another human being or in person or something like that. So these are what we'd call reactive or emotional questions, basically sensitive questions. Things people will hide or lie about, maybe judge answers unconsciously, sometimes try to please the experimenter or look better or sabotage the results if they're asked directly, or otherwise they're going to differ because they're being tested. So a solution in some cases with questions like this is just to ask more anonymously. This is often easy with surveys that you do over the internet, as long as they trust that it's set up to be anonymous. But even when the survey is collected in person, having them do it on a computer might get more real answers than if they're, answering out loud questions face to face, or even if they're handing in like a physical paper to the researcher at the end. In that case, you could, at least use a Dropbox or something. In fact, in the olden days of research, when they were asking about stuff like illegal or embarrassing behavior, they even had some clever tools and clever ideas like the random response method. Basically, in this one, the participant secretly flips a coin. Like you hand them a coin, you say, go in this room, you're going to take the survey, but what you got to do on every question, flip the coin before you answer the question. And if heads comes up, don't show anyone, keep it secret, but if heads comes up, just go to that question and answer yes. No matter what your real answer, just add yes automatically. Now, if tails comes up, answer the question truthfully. So what you do in that case, you end up with a mix of yes and no answers from all the participants, and usually a lot of extra yes answers, since a lot of people would have flipped heads sometimes, right? And the experimenter can't possibly decipher individual responses, since anyone answering yes to a question might have done so because it's the real answer, or they might have done so because they flipped heads on that question. So the researcher has no idea, can't blame or judge anyone for answering yes to something, even something illegal or embarrassing or horrible. But the researcher can analyze the aggregate of a whole bunch of people's data to see if a certain question is like far above the 50% yes mark. And with some math, you can actually get a really good estimate of how many people are a yes or a no on the question overall, even if you don't know anyone's individual answers. And when you're carrying out a survey, honestly, keeping it anonymous is the best practice if at all possible. And this is not just to get honest answers out of people, although that's important, but for ethical reasons, especially if some of your questions involve like personal or emotional issues or legal issues. Like imagine asking about someone's health or their mental health status or their traumas they've gone through, or maybe their beliefs and behaviors around sex or anything else people might want to keep private. If you don't keep the data anonymous, if you don't set it up in an anonymous way, then even a small possibility of a data breach, might not happen very often, but a small possibility of a data breach can actually be a big deal, since making that data public could legitimately harm people. Like in some countries, you get put to death for certain sexual behavior, right? So you want to make sure no one's at risk of horrible consequences because you didn't keep the data anonymous. But in cases where you can't guarantee anonymity, you can't set it up that way, confidentiality is at least the next best thing. Keep their personal info secret and protected, like with strong encryption, if there's some strong reason you can't anonymize things without compromising the study itself. But usually you can find a way to make it anonymous. All right, the last thing I want to talk about just briefly is the limitations of self-report as a way of getting at psychological questions. So imagine, for example, you ask a question on a survey like, would you ever have casual sex without a condom? What you might find is that a lot of people will say, no, I wouldn't do that. So your data says most people would never do that. Yet someday, maybe when they're super turned on with the right person, maybe when they're drunk, or when no condom happens to be available, but they're really desperate, or when a potential partner is shitty and they're being like whiny and coercive, someone might end up going forward without a condom despite their earlier intentions or their earlier beliefs about what they would do. So in that case, the self-report numbers may not match up with actual behavior. Or another way to put that, behavior may not match explicitly expressed attitudes, beliefs, or intentions. And also, a lot of the time, people are just crappy judges of how they're going to behave or feel in the future. When it comes to how we'll feel about things in the future, we call that affective forecasting, and people are just often not great at it. Like, consider this question. For each of the following, how would your happiness 1 year from now be affected? From 9, you'll be much happier, to 1, you'll be much less happy. And then you give them options like getting an A on your next exam, or getting in an accident and becoming paraplegic, or winning the lottery, or losing your textbook and having to buy another. Obviously, people are going to give very different answers to these options on average, right? Like winning the lottery will get a high number and getting in an accident will be a low number. Duh. But it turns out people are generally wrong about this, or at least not accurate about how happy or unhappy something will make them later on. Research actually suggests that in 6 to 12 months, happiness will generally go back to a person's sort of baseline happiness level. Even for literal lottery winners and people who become paraplegic, their happiness goes back to about what it was before. So the term for this one is impact bias. Like, we're bad predictors of how long and how much events will impact our future emotions. But the point here is people may not recognize their own cognitive biases or limitations, or how they're going to behave or think or feel in circumstances different than, right now when they're answering a survey in the here and now. So sure, we can take a survey and we can get answers of what people say they would do or say how they would feel, but that might not match the actual reality that we're interested in. Likewise, we might run into an issue sort of analogous to what Kinsey, a foundational sexological researcher, ran into. A long time ago, he and his colleagues were measuring all sorts of things about human sexuality at a time when this stuff wasn't well studied. It was kind of taboo in science. They had to get creative about how to measure some things, literally. So, for one example, Kinsey's team sent out postcards and asked people with penises to measure their penis on the postcard and send it back. A nice, kind of private way to collect the data without anyone needing to get naked in front of a researcher. But later data that was collected in person by medical personnel showed that actually people's self-report measure had not been accurate. Basically, a lot of dudes measuring their own size tended to measure in a way that biased the answer. So the lesson here is that people will self-measure things, whether they're physical things or psychological things. They'll measure differently than an experimenter might intend. That's true whether we're estimating our own memory abilities or measuring something more physical. So a survey question asking someone if they're above average in memory, or asking someone if they're more extroverted than their friends, they may give their own honest answer to these questions, but their responding might be subjectively biased in a certain way. It might not get at the real answer. An example often pointed to in this case is the implicit association test. Like, you can ask people outright, are you racist? Are you homophobic? Are you sexist? Are you biased against old people or overweight people or Muslims or gun owners or whatever? And people may self-report no, but that's because, based on their self-concept and their idea of racism or sexism, they might legitimately think they are not biased in those ways. But when we do a behavioral measure that we think kind of gets at something like racism or homophobia more directly, and we find that their behavior tells a different tale than their self-report answer, that suggests, the self-report might not have been getting at everything. So if you're not familiar with the implicit association test, the IAT, it's a computerized test aimed at detecting unconscious biases. So these aren't intentional things. People don't have these beliefs overtly, but they might kind of unconsciously, their brain has just been programmed based on associations people have that just go into our brain from past experience, from our development, from our culture, from stereotypes, whatever. So just for example, in some cultures, there's a stereotype that girls are better at reading and verbal skills, while boys are better at math. That is not necessarily true, but it's a stereotype people may have heard, and they've kind of absorbed it, right, unconsciously, even if their explicit beliefs disagree with it, and explicitly they consider everyone equal. So in the implicit association test, the IAT, a participant is told, for example, press the left arrow if a word pops up that is either a boy's name or a math-related term, and press a right arrow if the word that pops up is either a girl's name or a reading-related word. So it goes by fast, and they're supposed to respond as quickly as possible. So it's really getting at how quickly their brain can process words and concepts that relate to boys and girls or math and reading. So say numbers pops up, they're supposed to hit left, since that is math related. The word story pops up, they're supposed to hit right, because that's reading related. Emily pops up, right, since it's a girl's name, and so on. And people do this pretty accurately and pretty fast. But then the IAT has a condition like this, where you're told press the left arrow if it's a boy's name or a reading-related word, right arrow if it's a girl's name or a math-related word. This should be just as simple. Like if we do a between subjects design, put some people in one condition, some in the other, you would think they would be just the same amount of timing, right? So if the word numbers comes up, in this case you have to press right, since it's math-related. You always put the word numbers wherever math is. Books comes up, left arrow, since it's reading-related. Really easy. Sarah? Girls' names are right arrow, and so on. Yet, people are actually much slower at this version of the task. When books comes up, it's just harder to send it to the same side as a boy. Or when subtraction comes up, it takes just a split second longer to decide it goes on the same side as girl. And indeed, there's tons of variations of this test. Like one study that tested doctors and the sort of unconscious associations or biases relating to black or white patients that the doctors might have. Like they had a doctor sit in front of a screen, and if a white face came up, they hit the left arrow. Black face comes up, they hit the right arrow. That's pretty easy, just a simple perceptual test. And also, a word could flash sometimes, which might be a positive or a negative word, like pleasure is positive, crying is negative, stuff like that. So, black face, right click. Pleasure, that's good, so right click. Crying, that's bad, so left click. Black face, right click. White face, left click. Death, left click. Flowers, right click. You get the idea. All done as fast as possible. But in a different condition, they had doctors do the same kind of thing, but now they had bad on the same side as black patients and good on the same side as white patients. So now, pleasure pops up, or flowers pop up, or other positive stuff. You've got to click right arrow, which is the same as when white faces show. Bad stuff gets the same response as black faces get. And what do we find when comparing these two conditions? The doctors were much slower in the bottom setup. When white was paired with bad and black was paired with good, they answered slower, just a little slower, but their brains had to process it a little longer. Whereas in the top setup, when black was with bad and white was with good, their response time was faster. Basically, it was easier for their brain, unconsciously behind the scenes, to associate bad with black or good with white than the other way around. This is all totally unconscious. Their conscious answers would never say that. So the big lesson here is that self-report is not necessarily going to be accurate about all of our cognitive processes, our beliefs, our preferences, our behaviors, unconscious biases, or whatever else. Now, side note, just to be clear, some things about the IAT test, they've been criticized, especially since there are some mixed results on whether it actually predicts a lot of overt behavior in real-world situations, as opposed to things like just quicker processing on a artificial lab task on a computer. So the point is not about this test in particular, but the idea we need to be aware of here is that self-report answers may not tell us all we want. They may not tell us, when people aren't always going to be aware of all their own unconscious influences on their behavior, beliefs, thoughts, whatever. Or another way to put that, unconscious processes often cannot be self-reported accurately, only measured behaviorally. So a survey might have trouble getting at that. Okay, finally, one last thing to keep in mind about the limitations of using self-report methods, the way surveys do. This kind of builds on the last example, but imagine asking people an open-ended question, like, why did you vote for candidate X in the last election? People will confidently tell you the reasons for their choice, whoever they voted for, or the reasons for their behavior, right, for whatever behavior it is, after the fact. People will tell you why they did things when you ask them afterwards. But are they correct about their explanation for their own behavior? Or is it possible their brain is just filling things in with a plausible story after the fact, kind of confabulating after the fact? Consider that there's research showing people can predict who will win an election in a faraway foreign country between people they have never seen or heard of, just by seeing pictures of the two candidates. We literally have a bunch of evidence that people's voting behavior is influenced to a significant extent by things like visual images, how someone looks, how they're depicted, and other things that we might consider kind of shallow and irrelevant at the conscious level when you ask about preferences, why someone might vote for someone, but it still seems to influence people's behavior. So basically, people may not know the reasons for their behavior. This is something we've long known about in psychology. We are influenced in so many ways by our genetic propensities and our background, our environmental influences, and the current situation we're in. And as we saw, even by the way a question is asked, or the frame of mind that we're in, or whether we're face-to-face with a pretty experimenter or answering on a computer. All of these affect how we answer things, how we do things. So we may not think that those things affect our behaviors or determine our choices in any way, but they sure as hell seem to when we test it. So we as researchers need to remember that human self-report is not always the best source of information about their psychology. We know from research that people often construct a self-image or narratives and stories about their behavior and about ourselves after things happen, just as a way for the brain to sort of make sense of our past actions once they've already come about, even though they were probably influenced by lots of things we weren't conscious of. So to wrap up, I don't want to discount the value of self-report data that we can get from surveys. It is downright essential to the modern science of human psychology. For one, it's a method that allows us to get large sample sizes and to do it in a way that gets a representative sample so that our conclusions apply to the general population rather than just, the convenient group of people we managed to recruit in our local neighborhood or local college campus. Self-report can, of course, tell us all sorts of valuable things and help us find patterns. And as I mentioned at the start, we can use surveys to set up experiments within the survey, like using a different framing of a question about a given topic to see how that influences people's behavior or influences what they say they prefer or what they think they would do. So we can discover all sorts of interesting facts about human psychology, but it does require thinking carefully and following best practices when designing a survey and writing questions. A sloppy survey, one that's full of ambiguous, double-barreled, and leading questions, may be worse than no survey at all.